So I was in the hotel bar last night and looking at the agenda that Inga very kindly sent across to me. And Podrick's Fame hasn't quite made the UK yet. So I was checking out who was going to speak in front of me. And he's got a fantastic website full of stories. And when you go to the bottom, there's some testimonials. And one of the testimonials says that when Podrick speaks and starts the day, he creates a feel-good factor that lasts throughout the entire day. Now, I've got 25 minutes on the economics of excellence. We'll see whether that's true or not. So I'm also going to start with a bit of a story, a bit of background, true story as it happens. KPMG Nunwood, or Nunwood, the company that I represent, 5 years ago we decided to focus our business entirely on customer experience. And coincident with that, I was in the US on business, and I was flying between New York and Houston. And you know when you go onto an aeroplane and you sit down and people just ignore the safety briefing, you know, people just read their book and carry on or whatever it might be. And but this was a safety briefing with a difference, and it started with the line that says, "Ladies and gentlemen, normally at this stage of the proceedings, I would show you how to put your seatbelt on and take it off. But frankly, if you don't know how to take your seatbelt on and off, you shouldn't be out on your own." This is odd, so all the papers went down, people started looking up, and the briefing went on. It was very humorous, but the piece that stuck with me was the bit when the air hostess got to the part about what happens if the cabin depressurizes. And what she said was, in the event of a cabin depressurization, oxygen masks will be deployed from the panel above your head. If you're traveling with a small child, put your mask on before helping them with theirs. If you're travelling with two small children, decide now which one you love the most. And that was a seminal moment for me. And I came back and I talked to the other guys in our business. I said, it's fantastic. You can take something as mundane as an aircraft safety briefing and you can bring it to life. You can make it real. You can transform it. Now, the company that I was flying with was Southwest Airlines, one of the top airlines in the world for the way in which they engage with their passengers and the way in which their cabin crew behave. But it started and gave rise to the Customer Experience Excellence Centre, which I'm going to share some findings from in a moment or two. But I came back from that trip and we sat around and we asked ourselves 4 questions. The first was, what does a great customer experience look like from the perspective of the customer? So there are lots of stuff around the time about what it should contain, a lot of concepts and theory, but actually from a customer perspective, what's really important? The second question was, well, who in the world delivers great experiences? You know, what sort of companies achieve excellence in this area? And then the third question was, how do they do it? And we were much more interested in what they do and how they do it. And that gave rise to the Customer Experience Excellence Centre. But also as part of that, we wanted to be able to codify what these organisations did and actually make that available to the customer experience public, as it were, on a wider basis. So I'm going to share that with you now as we go through. So 3 parts we're going to talk about. The first is the economics of excellence. We're then going to talk about a strategic framework, so how you might start to think about linking all the metrics up in your organisation. And then finally some closing comments on how you think about transforming the experience. Customer Experience Excellence Centre, well, it's now 6 years old. We've got 1.5 million customer evaluations of the experiences they have with 992 brands. And all of that information is available from our website, and we produce annual reports that talk about excellence in the field. So I talked already about codifying the experience, and there are 6 factors that we've identified. And it doesn't matter whether you're in the UK, whether you're in Australia, whether you're in the US, these 6 factors are common. They don't change, they are universal. And these 6 factors are the lenses through which we view customer experience, and the lenses through which we measure customer experience. So the first of those is personalisation, the degree to which the experience feels unique to the individual. Now, one of the things about personalisation is that it's very much about self-worth, the psychology of the ego. It's how do you make someone feel better about themselves when they've had an interaction with you. The next factor is resolution. So the great companies in the world realise that from time to time, things will go wrong. There's nothing you can do about it. But the difference in those organisations is that they have a plan B. They are able to think about what parts of their process might fail and what do we do to return the customer to the position they would have been in had it not failed in the first place. Now, also around resolution, interestingly, there is something called the service recovery paradox. Some of you may have heard of it. The service recovery paradox states that in the event of a service failure, if you respond to that and deal with it brilliantly, the customer is more likely to feel better about you than before it went wrong in the first place. Now, not always true, and I wouldn't recommend it as a strategy for developing your experience, but nonetheless, fixing things brilliantly is really important. We've got a company in the UK called John Lewis, and they practice what they call heroic recovery, which is putting things right with style, making the customer feel great about you. But plan B is the important thing. The next area is integrity. So integrity is about creating trust. So integrity, trust, two sides really of the same coin. Now the thing about integrity is it has three dimensions to it. The first is what do you stand for as a business? And increasingly through our research we're seeing that organisations that stand for something more than making money for shareholders are engaging in the current consumer zeitgeist of what's important to consumers. They want to deal with businesses that are about more than making profit, but actually do something important for the human condition or the planet. So it's about a sense of moral purpose. And the top 10 companies in our UK survey all demonstrate a strong level of moral purpose. It's about how they interact with you and the standards you can expect from the interaction that you have with that business. The second area is competence. So we trust people who are competent. Now again, behavioural economics teaches us that we like people who seem like us, and we trust people who seem like us, and therefore it's all about being able to relate to the individual and to be able to show that you have the knowledge that individual needs at that point in time. So competence, being able to do what's important for the customer. And then finally it's about keeping promises, doing those things that you have committed to do and making sure that you deliver on the commitments that you make, both at the highest level, the brand promise, but also day to day. The next area is valuing time and effort. And one of the things that we see in the US is that organisations are increasingly talking about the return on time. So the opportunity cost that an individual has when they actually work with you as a company, when they try and achieve an objective with you. How do they feel about it? And the research shows that actually in any endeavour that a customer tries to undertake with you as a business, the amount of how they feel about it is driven probably about 30% by the kind of physical part of the transaction, but 70% of it, so 70% of how a customer feels about the organisation is driven about how they're made to feel as they go through that exercise. So, the emotion playing a very big part in that. The next area is expectations. Now, expectations are really important because in any walk of life, whenever we engage with a business or do something, we don't come in with a clean slate. We come in with a set of expectations. So knowing what your customers' expectations are at the outset, really, really important. But also, if you know what their expectations are, you can manage them, you can set them appropriately, and you can exceed them at key parts of the experience or in the customer journey. But you've got to know what those expectations are in the first place. And then the final one is empathy. Now, empathy is all about building rapport. It's about the organisation being able to put itself in the shoes of the customer and view itself from the customer's perspective. Almost impossible for most businesses to do that. It's a really difficult trick to pull. A company in the US called USAA does it brilliantly. They have what they call customer surround sound. They are constantly scanning and trying to understand the customer and to bring the customer into their organisation. So those are the 6 pillars, as we call them. They are the dimensions through which we view the experience. And we're going to talk about those a little bit more as we go through. So let me now talk about the economics of excellence. And one of the things that I would say is that there's almost a kind of pseudo-religious quality associated with customer experience, which is you've got to do it because it's the right thing to do. And that's partially true. But actually you've got to do it because it makes commercial sense. And for most organisations, they find it very difficult to justify investments in the soft dimensions that don't always have a tangible outcome. And therefore being able to quantify the benefit of the customer experience you deliver is a really important part of securing internal buy-in. And so from the point of view of understanding how the 6 pillars drive commercial outcomes, then, Padraig talked earlier about NPS, and I guess many of you will use NPS. But those 6 pillars, if you measure those 6 factors, the explanatory power of those 6 factors is about 65 to 70% of your NPS score. Now, the rest of that NPS score is stuff that's outside of your control. It's about consumer confidence, or it's about sector stereotyping. There's a range of things that go into NPS that actually the business can't actually, control itself. But these 6 factors explain about 65% of it. So you know that if you drive these 6 factors, you're going to drive your NPS score. Equally, if you've got other metrics, CSAT or customer effort or whatever it is that you're looking at, these 6 pillars equally have the same sort of explanatory power, and customer loyalty as well, about 65% on customer loyalty. So these 6 pillars drive commercial performance. They drive commercial benefit. If we look then at NPS generally, so there's a lot of work being done to look at the commercial benefit associated with NPS. And there's a really good paper which I'd urge you to get online from the London School of Economics, which has quantified the financial benefit associated with NPS and moving NPS in terms of commercial outcomes for the business. So in terms of the sort of the prime driver, which is the degree to which a 1% improvement in NPS affects a medium-sized organisation, then the benefit is around £8 million in terms of revenue, I think 8.8. But actually the value is in reducing the reasons for detraction. If you reduce the reasons for detraction, that's worth about 24 million. So in terms of prioritising what you're doing, it's as much about fixing the things that go wrong as it is about finding those things that delight. And we'll talk a little bit about more of that in a second or so. But the fundamental finding was that organisations that drive a high NPS score grow 4 times faster than the average for that group of companies. Now, this is a piece of work that we have done recently, and this piece of work was designed to sort of validate that LSE score, if you will, and also some of the other claims that have been made over 5 years. What we then did was we looked at their position in our survey, in our league table, if you will, and we compared and contrasted the top 100 in our survey with the top 100 companies in the FTSE index. And what we discovered was that in terms of revenue growth, if you were in our top 100 index, your growth was twice that of the FTSE 100 average. So a really strong and powerful indicator. Now, what we also saw over those 5 years is that margins have come under pressure. So margins have been squeezed. And actually, if you look at the margins of the FTSE 100, they dropped by about a quarter. Now, for those organisations in our top 100, their margins also been squeezed, but it only dropped by 5 points. So in a declining market, when you're under competitive stress, driving customer experience drives an improved performance around margin management as well. Doesn't rectify the problem, but it means you don't lose as much as everybody else at that particular point in time. So that's all very good. That all sounds really interesting and a bit conceptual. So I wanted to share with you a case study of an organisation that did really well in our US survey called Florida Power and Light. And they're a utility. And in our UK survey, not so sure about the Irish survey, but in the UK survey, our utilities come at the bottom, really, of our top 250 companies in the UK. The utilities hold at the bottom. We've just introduced the public sector, mainly to make the utilities feel a bit better about themselves, because they've now got some other organisations below them. Now, what's the the issue, really, that was faced by Florida and Power Light, a successful company? But 2005, Florida was hit by Hurricane Wilma. 80% of the population in Florida was without power, so no air conditioning, no cooling, no refrigerants, for 8 days. Okay, now for those of us who've been to Florida, that is a very painful amount of time to be without those important sort of qualities of life. Their reputation was in tatters, and as a business, they saw their stock price absolutely crucified on the Dow index. So they came out of that and they set themselves an objective, which is to rectify those issues and to put themselves back in a very strong position in the US market. And how they did it really is what makes it interesting, and the sequence with which they did it is interesting. So the first thing they started with was rebuilding trust, re-establishing integrity in the minds of the Florida public. And they did that through a number of different ways, but building their reputation through providing a solar lab that understood, really advanced technologies for transferring sunlight into power. They donated what they created, this equipment, to schools all around Florida. So schools no longer had to pay for power because it was largely driven by sunlight. They focused on wildlife, so the turtles in Florida, and the manatees and the panthers and all the things that makes the rich pageant of Florida wildlife, protecting those and showing the impact they had on the environment and minimizing the impact they had on the environment. It was all about establishing their credentials as an organization and re-establishing trust, whilst at the same time rebuilding the infrastructure, burying cables and the like. That took them 2 to 3 years. They then started to focus on 6 things that they then felt would make the difference, that would actually move them well up the scale in terms of performance. And those 6 things were, firstly, concern for customers, showing that actually we're really keen and concerned for customers as an individual. Re-establishing their reputation, credibility, back to being credible as an energy supplier. Dedication, environmental performance, community involvement, all of those things they focused on from 2009 probably to about 2011. Their objective, the thing that drove them during that period, was the degree to which, if you look at the chart on the right hand side, may not be so easy to read, but at the bottom is a trust score between 0 and 10, and on the left hand side axis it's about the bill saving. So it's about the cost of going somewhere else if you're a Florida Power and Light customer. And what they looked at with the scores was that if they had a score of 10, then the price difference that encouraged someone to go somewhere else was about 32%. So they in effect were able to charge a 32% premium if they delivered a 10 on the trust score. So this started to drive much of their commercial activity. And they invested from 2013 to 2014 massively in smart meters. And actually what they were doing, about concern for the customer, was equipping customers with the information they needed to manage their own power usage. So they changed the dynamics, the business model, from being a focus on price and cost to equipping the customer to manage their own costs. They transferred the responsibility from them to the customer using these smart meters, and did so brilliantly. The net result of that was that we saw between 2013 and 2015, so in March of this year, when we looked at the data, we saw a huge increase across each of the 6 dimensions. And what it shows is that for greatness, you have to get all 6 of those things right. It's really important to move all 6. But much more importantly was the commercial outcome, a 300% increase in their commercial value, in their stock value. So a huge performance improvement, validated by the commercial outcomes of the business. So how do we go about it? A very complicated slide, so I'll just talk at sort of a high level really about it. Most organizations have a single score: NPS, CSAT, customer effort, customer delight, customer forgiveness. There's a whole range of different measures that organizations like to gather around. That's fantastic. And at points in your life, that's a really important thing to do, is to kind of nail your colors to the mast. But what's really important is what underpins that, so what drives those scores, but also what contribution NPS or CSAT makes to your commercial outcomes. So you need to be able to link that score so that you can determine what the outcome might be. So for one of our clients, a bank, they know that if they increase their current account NPS score by 8 points, it moves their overall NPS score by 1 point, and that adds 5 million to the bottom line. So they have that line of sight between activity, measure, and commercial outcome, which for them makes it very easy then to justify investments in the customer experience. So beneath that relationship type view, which we use our 6 pillars for, we've then got the event type measures. So how does the customer feel when they interact with you after a transaction? So either an event-based survey or something similar, CSAT, will tell you whether the customer is satisfied and what the issues might be. But you want to link that into your 6 pillars. So now you've got line of sight between what happens on a day-to-day basis, what happens strategically on a relationship basis, what happens at a macro basis in terms of your overall measure, and then how that drives a commercial outcome. And that line of sight is increasingly what we're seeing organisations who do great stuff in this space beginning to adopt. And then kind of finally on this, which is just to sort of pull all this together, I guess many of you do use NPS, but if you look at NPS itself, and if you think back to those 6 pillars and the pie diagrams that showed that personalisation probably drives, I don't know, 20 to 25% of an NPS score, you might be tempted to go for the silver bullet. Let's go for the one thing that will make a difference to our customers. You're wasting your time. The sequence of activity that these organisations go through is, first of all, they look at integrity. Because if you look at an NPS score and you look at the verbatim comments, and you look at the score between 0 and 3, typically what customers talk about are integrity related. You didn't do what you said you were going to do. If we look at the resolution, so 3 to 6, so actually things went wrong and you didn't fix it, and things compounded, and it got worse. So 3 to 6 tends to be issues around sort of fixing things when they go wrong. 6 to 7 is about setting expectations. You know, you told me this was going to take a day, and actually it's taken 7. So missing the expectation. Time and effort, so really important, minimising time, minimising effort, making the customer feel good. Yeah, typically the issues or the positives associated with that are around a 7 to 9. But the bits that make the difference are personalisation and empathy. So all of these things that are along here are all about fixing things that go wrong. So really important to do that first, otherwise it'll undermine everything else that you do. But when you get those right, like Florida Power and Light, those 2 things at the end, concern for customers and personalising the experience, are the bit that makes the difference. So important piece of learning for us in terms of what you plan and how you put your strategic plan together. A number of organisations have made dramatic moves, but when we look at each of these organisations, we find that they've gone through that same process. You know, it's taken them, in Florida Power and Light's case, it was 10 years. For other organisations, it takes 5 years. For organisations that are higher up that NPS line, it'll take 3 years or 2 years. But there's a number of organisations that have done particularly well in this space by following that sequence. And if you're interested in that sequence, on our website, there's a little ready reckoner, which you can use to sort of for your own planning. So just finally, really, it's really important to get the strategy right, but the strategy is executed in the detail. It's what you do every single day that makes the difference. And I have a kind of favourite experience of the week done here is they show the flights in terms of almost a sort of time elapsed diagram. So when do you want to leave, when do you want to arrive? You can scan it instantly. But the bit that really makes the difference is that when you want to filter that, they ask you about departure time, price, or agony. The amount of agony you're willing to endure to actually make that flight happen. So how you articulate things, how you deliver things, the language you use, the way you present things on a day-to-day basis, really important. That's it. Thank you very much. I don't know if there's any questions.